Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Dino Grandoni, and I'm an energy and environmental reporter here at the Post and author of the Energy 202 newsletter. Today, we're going to have a great discussion about the electric grid and other energy policy. And to start us off, we have two senators who sit on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. To my left, we have Senator Martin Heinrich from New Mexico, Democrat on the committee, and to his left, we have Senator John Hoeven, who is a Republican from North Dakota. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get started, I want to let everyone know here in the room and online that you too can ask questions to the senators towards the end of this discussion using the hashtag 202Live on Twitter. So just text your question or tweet your question to 202Live, and we will try to get to that towards the end. In March of this year, the US government, for the first time, blamed Russia for cyber attacks on the US electric grid. They said the attacks might have happened, or the attacks started in 2016 or maybe even earlier than that. In response, Energy Secretary Rick Perry has proposed the creation of a new office to coordinate cybersecurity response from the United States. It has a long name, the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. But even he says that that might not be enough. He told Congress recently, "I'm not confident that the federal government has a broad strategy in place." So I want to ask you two, what does Congress need to do in order to respond to this threat from abroad?
I think one of the things that our government needs to do, and it's not, if the executive won't do it, the Congress should, is create a cyber doctrine, create a stance that we project to the world and say where some of our red lines are. Where are we going to draw the line when a foreign actor interferes in our infrastructure, our critical infrastructure? For years we've had a nuclear doctrine where Russia and the United States both understood where the other stood and where the red lines were and what the sort of state of play was and where are the places you just can't go. We don't have that in cyber right now, and it's really important if you're going to have deterrence to project some of those things.
Senator Hoeven?
Well, that certainly makes sense, but in addition, this is something we're all going to have to keep working on an ongoing basis because it's such a dynamic area, and it's harder to play defense than it is to play offense. And you've got not only Russia, China, Iran, other state actors, but you have non-state actors that are trying to hack into our grid system, everything from energy to our other governmental systems to private business systems. So it's not just government, it's got to be an enterprise with the private sector. I'm also a member of the Appropriations Committee, and I chaired Homeland Security Approps last Congress. And so it's something we looked at and worked on all the time. Homeland Security has responsibility. They certainly should continue to have that responsibility to work across all of the cabinet agencies and throughout government, as well as interface with the private sector to, on an ongoing basis, make sure that this issue is front and center. Also, I'm on defense appropriations, and we work on it on the military side through the services too. So this has to be an all of government issue. We want good coordination. I think largely that comes through Homeland Security and the military. And we've got to make sure we continue to coordinate with the private sector. We do that on the Energy Committee as well.
Somebody does have to own it, though. I mean, this touches, as Senator Hoeven says, it touches so many different aspects, private sector and within the government. But you can't have whole of government just be, it's somebody else's problem. Somebody within the administration does need to own it. And we need to do a better job culturally within the utility industries. My dad was a lineman. I grew up in the middle of utility culture, and usually if something's working, you just don't mess with it because it's working. And we have all these programmable logic controllers, all these SCADA systems scattered all over the country. And those have to be updated, they have to be protected, And that's a cultural change within the private sector piece of this too. So you have to have ownership and you have to have the cooperation that Senator Hoeven was talking about.
So where should the responsibility lie then? Should it be in Department of Homeland Security? Should it be in the Energy Department? Where?
I would say in an umbrella kind of way, Homeland Security, which is kind of how it works now. I think then what I'm saying is, though, you can't just say, oh, well, that's Homeland Security, DHS's responsibility. Energy, everybody else has to own it too in their world. So I think what Rick Perry's doing is right on. Every agency has to have that kind of effort, is what I'm saying, but you do have to have that overall coordination point, which now is in DHS and I think is appropriate.
Well, what do you think?
I think there needs to be a cyber command component to this as well. And there reaches a certain threshold where it's not just meddling, it's a hostile attack. And so you have to have someone at DoD fully capable of knowing when to engage and say, well, there are going to be consequences as well.
Right,
So,
and I agree on the, like say, DoD has its operation too when you get into state actors and potential defense aspect.
So I mentioned a state actor at the beginning, Russia, and Senator Heinrich, you had mentioned that the United States needs to respond when red lines are crossed. So I'll put this to both of you. Was this recent attack in 2016 that DHS and the FBI described a few months ago, was that the crossing of a red line and require some sort of response?
I'm not going to comment on the particulars of what their of that particular event. I'm not sure how much of that is classified at this point, but I would say we should all be very concerned that a state actor who is as talented and who has the resources that Russia has, when they start messing around within critical infrastructure, because the potential there is enormous. And we need to figure out how we're going to project to them, okay, what do we consider meddling and what do we consider a truly hostile, an act of war? And we have to decide that, and we have to project it to them, because they need to know where those red lines are too. And right now I don't think they know that, and they have a very lean forward approach to cyber work.
Senator Hoeven?
We have to push back on anyone that meddles with our elections. That's not acceptable. So whether it's Russia or anyone else that meddles in our elections, of course we have to push back on that.
Should these retaliatory measures be in kind to the cyber attack? I guess what I'm asking is, should we?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No. So you shouldn't box yourself into saying, well, if they commit a cyber attack on the United States, that we're going to commit a cyber attack. We have a lot of tools in the toolbox. Mm-hmm. We have to show that we're willing to have very serious consequences for them, but I don't think we should limit ourselves to an in-kind response necessarily.
Do you agree, Senator Hoeven?
Right. All options on the table, in any kind of confrontation,
Okay. Senator Heinrich, you had introduced a bill to add some quote-unquote retro features to the security of the energy grid, replacing some computer systems with some human or analog systems.
Actually, redundant backup is what how I would characterize it. So we've seen places where these cyber attacks have played out in a very real circumstance, like the Ukraine, where Russia has been invaded Crimea, had this sort of little green men approach where it's not clear whether you're dealing with soldiers or something in between, and they utilized cyber attacks to attack the grid, and we saw how that was responded to. And one of the things that you learn is that in addition to having this very smart grid that we need today, that is absolutely necessary, you also need to know where the physical switches are. You need to know where the backup controls are, and you need people who can go out there and do those things. And so having that knowledge, not saying we're just going to run everything from an iPad in an office someplace, is an important part of how you build resilience into the system.
Would you worry that introducing more human elements to it would create other types of vulnerabilities?
You know, most of our vulnerabilities are baked into the technology, honestly. And you want professionals who really know the system, who in an emergency can intervene and run physical controls if the smart controls and the electronic controls are disabled.
So I wanted to turn to a different facet of energy security, and that would be the reliability of the electric grid. As more wind and solar comes online, there is some concern among many in the administration that the United States won't be able to, or the utilities won't be able to reliably provide power to customers if it's only being made when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. Rick Perry had proposed a rule last year to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to provide extra compensation for coal and nuclear power plants that are able to run 24/7. FERC, whose chairman is going to be speaking right after this, rejected that rule. And most recently, Perry has come up with another proposal to use a 1950s Cold War era law to nationalize some nuclear and coal plants as a kind of emergency measure in the name of national security. So the oil and gas industry has opposed a lot of these measures. The coal industry is in favor of these measures. Senator Hoeven, these are two industries that are both important to your state. Mm-hmm. I was wondering what you think of these proposals from Perry.
So North Dakota's in the energy world, North Dakota's a powerhouse, and it's interesting because we are, in many respects, a microcosm of the country as a whole. We have, in terms of oil, we now produce about 1.2 million barrels a day. When I started there as governor, we produced less than 100,000. Now the only state that produces more oil is Texas. They're well ahead of us, but we're at 1.2 million, and I think the next closest may be California at about half a million a day, you know, about half of what we produce. So we produce a lot of oil, and then we produce a lot of natural gas. We don't even drill for gas, it just comes with the oil. It's a byproduct. And so we've had challenges building the infrastructure to capture and prevent it from being flared. But at the same time, we're a big agricultural state, and always have been a big agricultural state. So we do ethanol, we do biodiesel. The wind blows up there a fair amount, and so we have a lot of wind as well, solar and so on and so forth. Point being, a lot of states, you know, they either have oil and gas, so they're kind of fossil fuel, or they have the biofuels, so they're kind of on the renewable side. We have both, which is an incredible opportunity, but then we also recognize that you have to figure out how to make all this work. The interesting thing is, now I see a real confluence in terms of all the industries, both traditional and renewable, having to work together because we need distribution capability. We need transmission lines, we need electric lines, we need pipelines. We need the distribution system, transmission lines, the pipelines to move that energy from where we produce it to where it's consumed, okay? Mm-hmm. And we can't just go north and south, we got to be able to go east and west, right? So the challenge is getting everybody to work together to make sure that that distribution system for our energy grid in this country works. And we need to update it, right? You want it safe, you don't want spills, you want good environmental stewardship. You can't keep relying on the old stuff, you better build some new stuff. You can't move it all on the road, you better build some transmission. So we need to think about that as these issues come up. And so when we go to your question, in the same way, you got to think about base load generation, which you need to have. When the sun isn't shining and when the wind isn't blowing, you still want that light to come on when you flip the switch. You still want your air conditioning to work, and you still want some heat when it's cold, don't you? So we need to figure that out. We need to figure that out. And everybody, whether you're a variable producer, whether you're gas, whether you're wind, whether you're solar, or whether you're base load, you have a vested interest because we share the cost of building and using that transmission. So we need to do so to do it in a fair way, in an efficient way, right? So my question, that's a long way to say, yeah, we need to figure it out. We need to make sure we have enough base load so that when the variable providers aren't there, we still have the energy we need in the places we need it.
I have a sense that you might disagree with that.
So base load has become a political term. I can tell you, having grown up in a utility family, coal-fired generation plants go down, and they don't go down when it's planned. They go down, they go out. We need responsive energy in this country, and The way you can build that, there are places in the world today that have dramatically higher penetrations of renewables today than what most of our states are experiencing. And they manage that in a different way than what we used to do. You know, they look at forecasting, they look at how much the wind is going to be blowing, what the cloud cover is going to be, and they stack all of their energy sources against their demand model, and then they figure out how to bridge the gap. So I think what's interesting about these two efforts by Secretary Perry is they're just not market-based. And his own state, where he was governor and created a lot of renewables, has dramatically higher penetrations of those renewables than what we're dealing with in the places where these efforts were really designed to bail out a couple of uneconomic generators, particularly in the coal industry and a little bit in nuclear as well.
You have to be fair when you talk about market-based. There's a lot of rules, regulations, and tax impacts out there in the energy world that aren't necessarily market-based. So in North Dakota, we have an incredible amount of wind. We have billions invested from energy companies that produce wind. Same thing, coal, same thing, these other areas. But what are their relative regulatory burden? What are their relative tax burden? And what is their relative access to transmission lines? And who paid to build those transmission lines? In other words, if I pay to build the transmission lines, and then Martin comes along and he builds a different type of energy source, and he gets access to the lines I built before I do, is that market-based or fair? All I'm saying is everybody has an interest here to recognize that we have to have a grid that works for all of us and that provides energy 24/7, 365.
And I think one of the places we both agree is the need for additional transmission. I mean, our grid was built at a time when the way it functioned was very different.
Right.
It's hard to build transmission. It's largely done with investors today. And we need to figure that out because our grid needs to be more resilient and more responsive to the system today, which is not what it was when I was growing up, where it was a single generator
Right.
out to a transmission line, then to distribution, then to customers, be it a business, a factory, a home. Today, it's a multi-generational, it's a multi-directional machine. Consumers are producing their own energy. People want responsiveness. Demand response is as big a control on making sure that you're actually managing the grid as whether or not you're ramping up one form of generation or another. So I do think one of the places we could really create a lot of common ground is making sure that we're taking the steps to actually invest in the transmission that allows us to wheel electrons from one part of the country to another.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the need to build more transmission lines. The Trump administration has a plan in order to try to do that. It's to help streamline some of the environmental review processes for the construction of transmission lines, of pipelines, and of other infrastructure. What do you think of that then, Senator?
I think more than anything, we need an administration that is bought into doing the hard work of that planning process works when everybody's committed to it. And you know, I have been through some 10-year drug-out efforts trying to get transmission built, and we're on the verge of some major transmission lines in New Mexico right now that'll allow us to move electrons from, you know, where the wind blows hard to where the highest demand is. But the administration has not exactly been easy. So it's one thing to say you're going to have a legislative proposal that's probably not going to go anywhere. What I'd really like for them to do is just to engage in the NEPA planning process, make agencies work with one another. When you have the DOD wanting to do one thing and Interior doing something completely different, they could be the bridge to make all of that much more smooth.
Senator Hoeven, what do you think of the Trump administration's plan to help streamline some of these reviews? And I guess in addition to that, do you think that they should be providing some additional funding to help build these transmission lines, build pipelines, that sort of thing?
Well, I think the investment is there and ready to go. I think the challenge is getting through the regulatory requirements. I thought Martin described it well. So yeah, I think, again, you know, we want good environmental stewardship, we want good responsible regulation, but it needs to find ways to help make that investment happen. I think the investment is there, and ready to go if they can get permitted. So again, it's about doing it right, doing it well, but getting it done.
And one of the challenges is oftentimes with a large interstate project, you have a place where a lot of the generation is going to occur, and then you have a customer someplace else. There may be a state or two in between. Making sure that they have skin in the game and a way to benefit from that as well is a way to sometimes bridge the opposition where a state in between doesn't necessarily see the generation advantages or doesn't have the customers and says, well, we don't want this because it's just coming through here, but we don't have enough of the benefit.
I wanted to get back to this, this proposal to nationalize some of the coal and nuclear power plants. It's not exactly something you would expect to hear from a Republican cabinet official. Senator Hoeven, would that plan in particular, have you looked at it closely enough to come to an opinion on it?
Well, I can give you some thoughts. I haven't looked at it closely enough to really talk specifics in terms of his proposal, but in general, I don't favor nationalizing anything, but I do think you've got to make sure that baseload has access to the grid in a way that works. Now, I'm supportive of all forms of energy, but one of the concerns, and we're seeing it in our state, I mean, we really are a microcosm of this larger problem, and that is because it is so hard to build transmission, which, as I say, Martin described very well. We have cases where baseload invested, built transmission, which now they have secondary access to. So it's an asset you built, but somebody else gets access to it before you do. That's creating a problem based on the way they produce energy, where they're not a variable provider. They're not like a gas plant where it's easy to trigger it up and down. We need to figure something out to address this for them, or we're not going to have that baseload generation.
Senator Heinrich, you mentioned that you don't think this proposal to streamline NEPA is going to go through anytime soon, but you two have actually worked together on some bipartisan energy policy back in 2015. You're part of a group of senators that came up with a compromise between Republicans and Democrats where the United States lifted its ban on oil exports in exchange for the renewal of renewable energy tax credits that were due to expire. So I wanted to ask, for this Congress, is there any chance of any kind of bipartisan legislation on energy?
You know, our committee works pretty well. The question, I think, will be once again whether we can get the energy package that has already passed the Senate and with large numbers from both parties.
We've supported in more than one Congress.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What does it take to get the House to pass this bill? This bipartisan energy bill that's been out there for 4 years now.
You know, it's the world of the doable, right? Like, this is something we can get done, or we can, you know, have both sides wait for the perfect somewhere down the road. I think what 2015 really represented is we looked at where we could compromise, how we could create some certainty, and didn't let, you know, dogma get in our way.
I think we'll get it. And Martin and I have worked on other stuff, Indian Affairs. There's a variety of things he and I have worked together on, and some we've passed and some we haven't. Sometimes you just got to keep working it. I think we'll get there on the energy bill, and we have other bipartisan energy legislation that will move. You know, we all have some different ideas in this area, but the idea of trying to drive the investment and the technology forward in terms of the energy world, both to get more energy and better environmental stewardship, we agree on that as a baseline, and some of the hows in terms of, you know, what we do, we differ on. So I think he's right. Our Energy Committee works in a pretty bipartisan way on most issues, and I think we'll continue to advance legislation in this Congress.
I think, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today with the two senators. I wanted to thank both of you for coming out, and I wanted to let everyone in the audience know to please stick around because my colleague Steve Muffson is going to be interviewing the chairman of FERC, Kevin McIntyre. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Tina.
Okay,
thank you.